If I asked you what a D1 school means, what would you say? All right, now if I asked you what an R1 school means, what would you say? You would probably know what the first one means. D1 stands for Division 1. It's a category that tells you something about a school's sports teams. But there's a good chance that you have no idea what an R1 school is. I found that almost no one, other than some professors and graduate students, actually knows how the college and university system in America works at just the most basic level. It's not a secret. It's not as if people don't want you to know that. It's just that no one talks about it. No one really tells you how the college and university system works before you go to college. Myself included. No one told me how the college and university system works before I went to college. So I'm going to break it down for you. If you're thinking of going to college, or you're in college right now, or you've been to college, or you know someone who's involved in college at any level, what I'm about to say might help explain a few things. So let's talk about the way that schools are divided up. The most important category for college and universities is not whether their sports teams are Division 1 or Division 2. The most important category for colleges and universities is how much research they produce. Okay, let me say that again. The most important category for colleges and university has everything to do with how much research they produce. And that means that the most important category for major universities has nothing to do with the quality of teaching that goes on in the classroom. You might know that athletic departments in major universities get categorized as D1 or Division 1 if they have the most competitive athletes and a whole lot of funding as well. And then they're categorized as Division 2 below that, and then below that D3. Almost no one knows that the academic side of colleges and universities gets ranked too. A school gets a Research 1 or R1 ranking if they grant at least 70 PhDs and they dedicate at least $50 million towards research alone. So places like Harvard or Clemson or Texas A&M, those sorts of schools, they are called R1 schools. Below that, there is a Research 2 or R2 ranking, and those schools need to grant at least 20 PhDs and dedicate at least $5 million towards research alone. Those R2 schools often focus a bit more on teaching. Schools like TCU, East Carolina, Villanova, Wake Forest, those fall under the category of R2 schools. Then you have another category of schools called SLACs, SLAC, and it stands for Small Liberal Arts Colleges. Schools like Swarthmore or Davidson, those are SLACs. And those kinds of schools focus less on producing research, funding research in the same way that R1 and R2 schools do. And they focus a little bit more on teaching, typically. Now, of course, there are exceptions to all this, but in terms of the trends, they tend to focus more on teaching and a little less on research. And then finally, you have community colleges whose faculty focus solely on teaching rather than research. And often the faculty at those institutions, their salaries are going to be on average much lower than at institutions like an R1 school, an R2 school, and sometimes at SLACs as well. The instructors at community colleges are there really solely for teaching, solely to teach the students in the classroom. At community colleges, it's often the case that doing research for any sort of instructor or faculty member is fine as long as it doesn't get in the way of the teaching. The teaching is really the first priority for faculty at community colleges. Okay, why does any of this matter for the average person getting an education? Because these categories, R1, R2, they can affect the quality of teaching that you get at a major university. And why is that? Because at R1 and R2 universities, if a professor is facing these requirements to do a ton of writing and research, well, guess what part of the job has to suffer to make way for all these writing and research requirements? Teaching. Now, don't get me wrong. Some professors at R1 and R2 universities can be excellent at doing a whole lot of research, all the research that's required to be a professor at an R1 university or an R2. And they can also be excellent teachers. There are plenty of them out there. And if you find one of those professors, you want to hang on to them and learn everything that you can from them. But that kind of professor is pretty rare. And the point is that good teaching just isn't rewarded in the same way that good research is rewarded at that R1R. So working on the quality of your teaching just isn't as incentivized as much for professors. And what we mean by research, for many cases, is getting your writing published in good academic journals, sometimes producing books about whatever research you're doing, that sort of thing. And by and large, getting published is the most difficult part of being in academia, being a professor. On the whole, getting published is vastly more difficult than teaching. It's not even close. And research, writing, publishing, and then teaching in a classroom require completely different sets of skills. To be a good teacher, you have to speak well in public. You have to make very complex material accessible in the classroom to students. You have to often get creative in the ways that you're teaching this complex material to students who often are hearing this sort of thing for the very first time. But to be a good researcher, at least in philosophy, which I'm familiar with, you have to have a mastery of conceptually difficult academic style writing. Even at the elite college level, not every professor is good at both cutting edge research and also delivering accessible material in a classroom. Most people think that the main job of a college professor is to be an expert in their field and be focused on teaching what they know to students in the classroom. That's what the professor is there to do, right? Is to teach students in the classroom their expertise about whatever subject area they have mastered. For some schools, that's right, but for research-based schools, that's really only partially right. Let's take the field of philosophy, for example, the field I know. I have published my research in journals, and I have taught classes at a major university where I did grad school. If you're a philosophy professor at a research school, no matter how good you are at teaching in the classroom, the understood agreement by everyone, yourself included, is that if you don't produce enough research and writing within about 6 years of being hired, there's a good chance that you lose that job in that department and that you, in some cases, become unemployable in academia. Sometimes for good. Again, this information isn't a secret. It just isn't talked about that much. If you are a professor already teaching, you know this. If you're a grad student getting your PhD and you're looking forward to the job market, you know this already. So why does the system work like this? Remember, professors at research-based schools are expected to produce research. That is how schools get their funding. That's how they get their money. The reason that they are categorized as research schools and get money accordingly is because their professors do a certain amount of research. That's the expectation. Teaching just isn't prioritized in the same way. So for research-based universities, the teaching is devalued in pretty much every sense. Now, right or wrong, that's the case, but the teaching in terms of the funding that you get and the priority that it takes is typically for research universities going to be far lower than the research. But all that is assuming that your class is even taught by an actual professor there in the department. At research schools, there's a good possibility that your class that you take is not taught by an actual professor in the department, but by a graduate student who is frantically trying to write their dissertation, maybe taking courses, that sort of thing, and is working on all that simultaneously. That was me. And graduate students at those sorts of schools are desperately trying to publish their research, their writing, so that they have even just a tiny chance of getting hired at any school anywhere. Remember, some of the funding that goes to research-based schools needs to go to PhD students because they have to grant a certain number of PhDs in order to qualify, in order to meet the conditions for being an R1 school or being an R2 school. But those PhD students are only paid a stipend. They are not paid a salary. And believe it or not, this is completely true. Most research-based schools actually forbid PhD students from taking on another job to make up for that huge financial loss because of how low that stipend is. I cover this in another video that I'll link to below, so check that out if you have more questions on that. But keep in mind, these research-based schools often have millions and millions, sometimes billions and billions of dollars that they can just dedicate to research. They just choose to invest that money in ways other than their own PhD students that they admit, and then they ban them from working other jobs to make up for that loss. If they do find out that you're working another job so that you don't go into this crippling debt after you're done, you could just get completely thrown out of that department in the program, and then all those years of working towards your PhD are just completely wasted and done. This system then becomes an unfortunate filtering process for grad students, because what kind of PhD student can flourish on a stipend that's about $15,000, $20,000 in that ballpark per year in this economy? You'll need to be the kind of person who is already rich or is extremely frugal. So some of your classes are going to be taught by these PhD students, these grad students who are really struggling financially. Most of them are, and have no teaching experience at all, sometimes very little experience teaching at all, probably got no training or very little training to actually like teach in the classroom. So they're struggling financially, they're struggling emotionally, and they're struggling academically to try to do all these things to get out of this program and get a job someday. Okay, so what's the point of saying this? Why am I saying all this? I think everyone should know how the higher education system works. Again, you might be someone who is about to go through it. Maybe you're someone who has already gone through it. Maybe you know someone who has gone through it, will go through it. Almost everyone is touched in some way by the higher education system, regardless of whether you've been to college. It's at least something that most people consider in some way or another as they get to their last year of high school, as they're looking toward a certain age. Maybe you're looking to get back into the education system. So it affects so much of the country, but I'm always surprised in a way that this is just so rarely talked about. Almost no one, in my experience, knows the ins and outs of how the college and university education system works. SLACs, small liberal arts colleges, and community colleges are there to focus on the classroom and teaching. And there are fantastic professors at research schools who care deeply about the quality of their teaching and impacting students. I've had some of these, and I know many professors at research schools who do care deeply about the quality of their teaching in the classroom as well as their research. But what I'm talking about here is the university system. The university system is set up almost exclusively to reward research. And if that's the case, it just ends up making teaching and the quality of a classroom a lower priority, lower than research. It also means a decent number of classes will be taught by professors who would actually rather be researching rather than teaching. Professors who are under immense career-defining pressure to publish their writing and research, and taught by PhD students who are paid very little and are under even more pressure to publish their research and writing. So at research universities, the students in the classroom are just not as prioritized as much as you might expect. So again, given how much the higher education system touches so many facets of our culture and our lives, I think everyone should be informed about how this system works. Professors and grad students know all this already, but for some reason, this information just doesn't get communicated to the students in the classroom or their parents, who often are the ones paying the most for the tuition at research-based universities. So somehow research-based institutions need to find some way to incentivize teaching and public-facing education. Maybe not for every professor, and maybe not even to the same degree as research in every case. But the system as it currently stands deprioritizes the students in the classroom. If we want schools where that student-professor relationship flourishes, schools need to find incentives like pay raises or promotions for professors to teach at a high quality level.